I can't hear why.
I'm just going to wait another couple of minutes while people join. Okay, I suggest we start now. We may have a few more people joining, but I don't want to keep the rest of you waiting any longer. So we've all joined on time. I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Socialist History Society. We're really pleased to have Gregory here to give this talk, and it's really for two reasons. Firstly, I'm corrected from comments I was making only a few days ago that younger people, younger academics are not really interested in the history of the Communist Party. But Gregory really is proving himself a very positive exception to that, as well as obviously the transnational aspect of his work. But secondly, when I actually saw the original proposal for this talk, I thought this one's a bit obscure, isn't it? But having actually read the paper, I've realized actually how significant the work Gregory's doing is, because it actually raises a whole debate about what the position was in the British Communist Party after the war, after the Second World War, and the whole issue of which direction it was going on, and the debates that were happening within the British Communist Party, which bluntly are not covered very well in the, so we say, the semi-official history that have been published, but also the transnational nature of the debate. So it isn't just about letters from Australia, it's actually about debates that were happening in local branches of the Labour Party, including, rather interestingly, in the area in which I live, in Dulwich, and actually found within the paper some links to some work I'd done on Dulwich communism a year or so ago. So I found to my amazement that there was a link between the Australia debate and my own research on local radicalism and communism in this area. So this is going to be great. If it's as good as the paper, which I'm sure it will be, Gregory is going to talk for about half an hour and he's got a PowerPoint. So over to you, Gregory. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all attending. I hope you enjoy the paper. I'll just share my screen now. If you can see this. Can everyone see this okay? So yeah, I'll just give you a brief overview. So I'm a PhD candidate at Edgehill University. I'm in my final year as doing my PhD. And I'm researching British and Australian communism in the post-war period. And one of the reasons I thought this was an interesting debate that I think is worth commenting on is I think it says a lot about the different so-called roads to socialism in both Britain and Australia. Given that they were both in, the Britain's empire, they were both Anglophone countries, they were of a similar size, had the same language, I thought it was interesting to see where they differed in the post-war period, given these similarities. So I hope today that I'll go through much of where their kind of divergences came from, or where these disagreements sought to tread the path almost for the trajectory of both parties into the post-war period. So first of all, I think it's best to give you an the background for what actually happened in the immediate post-war period. So for those who don't know, again, this will be obviously a retelling of what most of you, I'm sure, will know, but the Communist International, or the Comintern, was disbanded in 1943. And this was a body that was set up in 1919 to essentially assert the direction of travel for all communist parties. It was a policy-making body. However, this was disbanded in 1943 by Stalin as a goodwill gesture to the Allies, which underlined, at least for now, for the Soviet Union, international proletarian revolution was not the foremost item on the agenda. However, within a few years, there was the creation of the Cominform. This was a different body from the very outset. It was not to include, crucially, the communist parties outside of Europe, apart from those in the Soviet bloc, and also the largest parties, French and Italian parties. Crucially, the British Empire, so the parties, both parties we're talking about here, were not included, nor was the parties in Latin America, in Africa, the Chinese parties in Asia, for example. And it's important to state that this kind of, the Cominform led to what was called the two camps thesis, which was essentially a binary divide between the capitalist West and the Soviet East. It was a divide between the so-called imperialist camps and the democratic camps led by the Soviet Union. And as I've just kind of mentioned, what's important is that neither of these parties were neither of these parties were included within the Cominform. So they were to look now to the French Communist Party and to the Italian Communist Party for guidance, given this direct link with the Soviet Union no longer existed. And I'd argue that this absence of direct support almost and direct link with the Soviet Union therefore kind of created a means for these different parties outside of the Cominform to tread their different paths, to take different ideological routes to socialism in their view. And to begin with where we see the beginnings of this debate or this exchange between the two parties, I think it's worth to kind of go over the initial misgivings, because it wasn't something that just emerged out of nowhere. It was something that the Australians, at least, had been debating for a while. So as early as 1946, the Australians took issue with the CPGB's perceived closeness to the Labour Party. For instance, in one Central Committee meeting, he noted Lance Sharkey, who was later to become the General Secretary, that the CPGB lacked sufficient punch. They were too close to the Labour Party, in his view. They were essentially reformist in character. And later into 1947, we have what is the inaugural Communist Parties of Britain's Empire Conference. This was in February and March, and it was seen as, again, in the absence of the Comintern, to be an opportunity for the British Party in particular to take a kind of coordinating role almost for the rest of parties within Britain's empire. Particularly given it was in the centre of empire, it was important for it to aid and abet further links with colonial parties and to kind of provide logistical support or political support in some ways. However, I think it's interesting that immediately after returning and whilst he's there, the Australian delegate Henry encounters Pollitt and writes back to the CC that he had already taken up his grievances with the CPGB Central Committee. And he was kind of patronizingly put down and told to kind of keep to himself. You know, conditions here in Britain are different to in Australia. What you're saying is not applicable. So but he also remarked in his letters back home on what he saw as a growing disillusionment amongst many of the colonial parties who were beginning to take a more hostile insurrectionary route. What they felt was, you know, going to be a period of decolonization. And they felt as if the CPGB line was too focused on what was going on in the Labour Party, in the centre of Britain's empire, rather than directly in the colonies. And he even said, Henry, about his exchange with Pollitt, "I didn't pull any punches, but I tried to be polite about it." And now this says, to me at least, that they were still unsure about how they would kind of articulate their criticisms. Where should they begin to kind of put forward these criticisms? Because again, it's an international movement. It's about being an international bloc. They didn't want to have any disagreements come out into the open, because that would have been opportunity for the capitalist press in there to attack them, essentially. And this was illustrated in September 1947, where Henry, again, who had been the delegate to the Australian Party, said, "I still think we do not want our members sitting down having lots of discussions about the sins or otherwise of other people and neglecting to do the work here in Australia." So for them, at least at this time, it was something that needed a little bit of time to kind of mull over and see how they could put these criticisms into action. So just for a quick summary to let you know who is who. On the left here, we've got Harry Pollitt. He was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain for a long time, from 1929 through to 1956, apart from a brief period during the Second World War. And on the right, we have Lance Sharkey, who, though he wasn't the official General Secretary at this point, he was, in my mind, the kind of de facto leader, because the previous General Secretary J.B. Miles was unwell and his health was deteriorating. This photo actually, this sketch even, interestingly, is actually from a 1949 trial. He was put on for sedition and eventually sentenced to 3 years for suggesting that if the Soviet Union invaded Australia, he would welcome them and he would support them. But the exchange itself, I think it's worth me just reading this out to you to kind of illustrate. This was said in public. This is not something that communist parties would typically do. They are private organizations. They are centralized organizations. And the British said to the Australians in July 1949, "We make the strongest protest against the uncomradely and uncommunist action you have taken in allowing such an entirely false presentation as a policy of our party to be published without any prior consultation with us. Such methods as you have seen fit to adopt have nothing in common with international practice amongst communist parties and between communist party leaders. We shall reserve the right to take whatever steps we consider necessary to correct the misleading and false impression you have deliberately created." And as you can see, that's why I got the title for this presentation, Uncomradely and Uncommunist. I think it's quite a memorable little phrase that they use. But this little passage here, I think, is very important. It's, for me, I think it says a lot about the disagreements between the two parties. It shows that the Australians were attempting to kind of break down the established hierarchy between these parties. They were no longer wanting to be under the tutelage, so to speak, of the British. They wanted to demonstrate their newfound independence. But before we get into why I think that, I think it's important to say what were the Australian party's main critiques. First of all, as I've kind of already illustrated, they felt as if the British party had downplayed their anti-imperialist role. They weren't doing enough for a party based in the centre of empire. Secondly, they felt they had echoed the line of the Labour Party on too many issues. They were becoming a social democratic party in all but name. For instance, their policy on strikes, which was essentially an anti-strike position in the immediate post-war period. Their pro-production policy from throughout the Second World War and afterwards. And this led to what they termed a kind of Browderist mindset. And this is worth just me explaining for people who aren't familiar with the kind of jargon of Communist Party kind of theory in this period. But Browder was the leader of the United States Party. He was the general secretary. And he was ousted in April 1945 following a kind of Soviet-approved denunciation from the French number 2, Jacques Duclos. And he suggested that the American Party should voluntarily dissolve themselves, change its name, remove all the kind of Bolshevized jargon like cells, and take up a position in keeping with American values. So the suggestion that the British were similarly following this fashion after it had been given the kind of stamp of disapproval from the Soviet Union was quite a stinging critique. And finally, as the debate continued, the Australians added to these initial 3 kind of critiques a stifling of what they deem minority opinion at the CPGB leadership, particularly as amongst many of the local branches. Here I've just included a few examples from Tribune, overwhelmingly, which was the Australian Communist Party's newspaper, which is thankfully available online via Trove, digitized in full. And as you can see from 2 of these in particular, the Australians were taking this issue to the very maximum. They were publishing it in all of their various regional newspapers. They were publishing it in Communist Review. They were having this debate pretty much constantly in the Central Committee. They wanted this to be an opportunity to do many of the things that I've just kind of outlined. They wanted to demonstrate their independence. They wanted to criticize the British Party for what they perceived as a reformist character. It was very much something that they were committed to for a number of months. Now, this section is taken what was called the Empire from Harry Pollitt's new kind of booklet, which spelled out what the program of the CPGB would be in the post-war period. It was called Looking Ahead in 1947. And in Looking Ahead, he used this phrase, what was called the Empire. And this was something which the Australians kind of took issue with. Sharkey noted in his review, which was to kind of set off the hostilities between the 2 parties, that, I quote, British imperialism is already a thing of the past. I'm sure the African people do not share this view, nor does the Indian Communist Party believe that British imperialism has given up the ghost in India. So again, it was throughout their critiques this strong kind of alignment with what they believed to be a insufficient anti-imperialist campaigning. And to do so, they called upon the support from many of these colonial parties. It wasn't simply something between 2 relatively minor parties within the communist movement, but also an attempt to kind of build hubs or spheres of influence between parties they believe to be on the same track or same viewpoint as their own. So, for instance, many times throughout the debate, many of the Australian party leaders kind of echoed or made use of the support from the Indian and the Malayan communist parties, even to such an extent that Sharkey actually published his main critique, his first critique, in the journal of the Malayan Communist Party's journal. That doesn't go to suggest that this was something that they thought they could take further with the support of many of these colonial parties. And again, it was clear that this was something that they wanted to do. In fact, he said this in one of his letters to Pollitt. We have no desire to go behind your back, but on the contrary, desire to challenge your policy before the international movement. So as I'd like to underline, I think this is a breakdown in the established hierarchy of command, particularly following the kind of the dissolution of the Comintern and the lack of involvement in the Cominform. The next part I want to focus on is what I see as being the differing identities between these parties. So at least for me, I believe that the Australians were attempting to create distance between themselves and the British, particularly as they moved to the left on domestic policy, which would come to its head in 1949 with the coal strike. Meanwhile, They also attended, as I've kind of made clear with the references to the support of many colonial parties, the Australians were attending many of these conferences and congresses of many of the other colonial parties. So, for instance, Sharkey, it's been alleged by the press at the time and by some historians, though it has been disputed, he's been alleged to have given the kind of the go-ahead for the Malayans to conduct the Malayan emergency in 1948, and being involved in the new insurrectionary line of the Indian Communist Party. However, this has been disputed by many historians, including Philip Deary, amongst many others. But in terms of the identity, I've seen at least a kind of feeling as if the Australians wanted to contrast what they saw as an association with colonial Britishness, this idea of the white Australia policy, which was the racial segregationist policy in Australia, which the Australian Communist Party were campaigned against. And they felt as if they were being discriminated against it by other colonial parties for their association with this policy. So their identity was being built in opposition to it, as it was tarnishing their authentic anti-imperialism. And also, what is worth mentioning is that Sharkey also attended this conference in Calcutta, which he was the only non-European delegate to do so, and apart from the Yugoslavian delegate. And this would be something which we would return to later, when the British are kind of trying to dismiss many of the claims that the Australians have made. This CIA document from 1949, I think, attests to the new coordinating role for the Communist Party of Australia. It shows their strong engagement with many of the communist parties in their region and their strong supportive role for many of the parties at the time, particularly as many of them were undergoing decolonization. And I think this difference is worth just to bring up, just to illustrate the differences in the trajectories of both parties. One was becoming particularly more militant and taking a much more kind of sectarian approach than the other. Now, I think it's worth to go on to what the British Party said in response. So crucially, to kind of frame what they were using as their kind of retort, is that they said, with the background of Yugoslavia being expelled from the Cominform in June 1948, that the Australians were following a so-called Titoist line. And because of their positive statement that they made in many of their press statements and in their party publications, it was a means for them to kind of demonstrate again this idea that you weren't in keeping with the authentic kind of communist line set by the Soviet Union. No, Tito has now been denounced. He has now gone from a hero in the fight against fascism to a heretic and a traitor, and even a fascist within a few years, which shows a kind of ridiculousness of this, of the kind of policing of communist identity in this period. And they were suggesting that the Australians, because they had taken on a Titoist line, they were following a frenzied leftism, they called it, in the manner of the recently denounced Yugoslavia. And Brian Pearce, who was later a historian of the party, even said to the Central Committee of the British Party that this may have been formed at that previous Calcutta conference. So you can see here that whilst on one hand, the Australians are suggesting a kind of coalition of parties who are disagreeing with the reformist, reformist Browderist kind of insufficiently anti-imperialist group policy of the British. Meanwhile, the British are saying that the Australians are following a Titoist line and they should be discredited also. So you can see, even though it's following a lot of these kind of jargonistic, typical kind of communist language, there are differences in how they're trying to kind of gain approval in this period. And whilst both parties had made positive statements on the Tito and Yugoslavian situation, they quickly backtracked because, again, of this policing of identity. They no longer wanted to be seen to be following such a line. This particular quote, I think, is worth kind of explaining. So, after the beginnings of the kind of dispute, in one of the discussions in the British Party's Central Committee, I believe, I can't remember who said it off the top of my head, but basically they were saying that we may be Marxists, but we can't claim to be magicians. We can't have foreseen the victory of the Labour Party in 1945. This is why no party, no actor saw this coming. It's therefore unfair for you to criticise us. But again, for me at least, this is where I find many of these criticisms the most interesting. How did these criticisms actually impact the wider membership, the wider rank and file? It wasn't simply something that was just tittle or tattle between two leaderships of two parties, but it was also something which would impact many rank and file members. It's hard to gauge the extent to this, as the CPGB forbid some of the publications of some of the Australian Party's letters at the end. However, it is certainly clear that they were in contact with sympathetic British members. For instance, the most notable of this, which has been, was Edward Upward's The Rotten Elements, which was a novelisation of his experiences in the 1940s, which was published in 1969, I believe. And interestingly, the leadership of the British Party kind of regarded these rank and file members who took up and agreed with the criticisms of the Australians as being sectarian hotspots, as having no echo chamber outside of small pockets within the party's local membership, noting Cambridge, Lancashire, Leeds and Peckham as particular hotspots. And it was clear, for me at least, I kind of agree with Lawrence Parker on this, that the Australians' criticisms were in many ways amplification of critiques from the CPGB's left in 1945. At the party's 18th Congress in 1945, there were many rank and file critiques of the kind of perceived closeness to the Labour Party, this idea of a peaceful transition to socialism, the lack of distinctiveness essentially from the Labour Party. However, it's also clear that the Australians were deliberately causing conflict in the hope of change at the top of the CPGB. So Sharkey made this clear on numerous occasions when he was talking to many of his fellow comrades in the Central Committee. He said, "There is no hope for them so far as we can see, but to get rid of Pollitt and his particular lieutenants." And to lead on to this final point here, I think, which illustrates their kind of, isolation from the wider international movement and their kind of exclusion from the wider Cominform, is the fact that both parties appealed to the French and Italian parties, who, it's worth remembering, was supposed to be their kind of go-between between them and the Soviet Union. So Pollitt sent a letter to the Italian and French parties, which appears to have been unanswered. Meanwhile, the Australian party, whilst they got support for many of their kind of criticisms, they did not get the official kind of rubber stamp of approval from Jacques Duclos in February 1949. And I think it's actually interesting that the Australians went to Duclos, because it's worth remembering again that Duclos was the figure who gave the official denunciation of Browderism back in 1945. And they believed, at least, that this was a similar instance. However, this was not to be the case, to their Australian party's dislike. And they were to claim in later years and in these letters that they were doing so not for their own party or even for the British, but for the membership of the colonial party. However, it remains to be kind of debated whether that was the case. And this is where I think it leads neatly on to what would become the so-called national road to socialism era. And this is something that I'm kind of working on now. It's very much part of my thesis. I've just been to Australia relatively recently to look at the material there. And I think, at least from what I've gleaned from much of the material in the archives and this debate, is that it very much sets the stage for what would be their different trajectories. It's worth just mentioning kind of what these documents are. So the British Road to Socialism came first and was certainly more of an influential and kind of programmatic, more of a political statement from the CPGB. It would undergo numerous revisions throughout its existence, whereas the Australia's document was, I'd argue, something which was kind of given second thought. They were too preoccupied with kind of ensuring their own legality, basically, because the Cold War environment was much stronger in Australia. So to conclude, I would argue that this exchange shows their differing ideological paths, which would later inform their roads to socialism. The British road to socialism would be very much echoing much of the critique that the Australians would make. For instance, it said that Parliament would not be overthrown, it would be kind of revitalized, which was obviously a big change in kind of communist theory. And similarly, I would say that this kind of debate demonstrates a breakdown in the hierarchy of international communism, particularly for these parties outside of the Cominform. You know, the Comintern was disbanded in 1943, and these parties no longer had a direct link with the Soviet Union. And I think this debate attests to such of a lack of such direction. Thirdly, I think it illustrates this kind of internal policing of communist identity, both within the structures of the party, within local memberships, but also in the kind of way that they pushed it outwards. They were trying to use it as a means of demonstrating their authenticity, their holier-than-thou attitude almost towards other parties. As the exchange became kind of dominated by accusations of Marxist impurity and sectarianism, which I think demonstrates the boundaries of acceptable debate. And finally, I think it signals these shifts in policy between the colonial parties on the one hand, which were beginning to take a more insurrectionary tone, and the CPGB. And I think the Australians tended to kind of take the role or subsume the role of the British. And yeah, that's basically everything. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Gregory. That was excellent and a great PowerPoint, which I think helped us a lot. So lots of time for comments and questions. If you can either put your hand up using the reactions button on Zoom, or if you don't know how to do that, wave at me and I will try and pick you up. You'll need to be obviously unmute yourself when I call your name. Right, John Atfield first.
Sorry, always have to hunt for the unmute button. So the Australian path to socialism, would you characterize that as an anti-colonial path? Obviously, the British road to socialism was not anti-colonial because of Britain's different position. But did the CPA perceive itself as being in an anti-colonial struggle, perhaps akin to the Indian Party? And maybe, if I may, a secondary question, where does the driving force come from in this impression of a kind of formation of a colonial bloc? Was it more from the Australians, or I would have thought probably more from the Indians?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you want to respond to that, we'll take one question at a time. So, Gregory to respond.
In response to the second one, so a kind of idea of this colonial bloc, I'd say that it was probably something that was put forward by the Australians, again, because they wanted to kind of take this role of being a coordinator, because there was a stronger party within the region. But at the same time, there was particularly at many of these kind of international congresses and, for instance, the Empire Conference in 1947, there was this idea that they had a shared perspective on the kind of, pardon me, disagreements with the British Party. There was throughout many kind of suggestions that they were kind of creating a, you know, they were trying to put in the members of the party into the leadership who were seen as being more insurrectionary, less reformist, less kind of more hostile, more militant. What was the first question again? Because I didn't. If that's okay.
Whether the CPA's Australian path to socialism policy was focusing on anti-colonialism. So in that sense, contrasting to the British road to socialism.
I think that's again, this is something that I'm researching at the moment. But I would say from what I've kind of got from the Australian path to socialism is a smaller document. It is very much something which I would argue is kind of just created to fit a wider kind of movement towards this idea of having a path to socialism, having a road to socialism. But I would argue at the same time that the Australian Party was certainly more involved in anti-imperialist struggle. It only was in the kind of 1950s that the British Party took a more active role in regards to Africa and what was going on at that time. By the time it got to 1951, much of what was going on in the decolonization process in Southeast Asia had already already occurred, and the Australians had already had a strong role to play, as you can see with the CIA document. And also, I didn't get a chance to mention it because obviously it's you always have to cut things out. But one of the things that the Australians constantly kind of referred to was this idea that they were in Asia. They are geographically closer to many of these colonies. They are almost given the geographical proximity, almost a responsibility to do many of these things. And given again the kind of uniqueness of Australia with its white settler, kind of location with the White Australia policy, I think they were trying to build their identity in opposition to many of these things, which for the British, it was always this kind of uncomfortable relationship between, on the one hand, wanting to support anti-colonial movements, but then on the other hand, trying to be almost kind of patriotic and in line with what they saw as kind of British national values, which I don't think is as strong in Australia. I hope that answers.
Thanks. Vijay Singh, you're next.
I don't know where to start. But there are some questions which I had before the talk. One is that Sharkey attended the Second Congress of the Communist Party of India in Calcutta. And he gave support to the dominant section of the CPI at that point, which was led by Ranadive. And the peculiarities of Ranadive were that he was actually fighting for socialist revolution in a country which was regarded generally as still a colony or semi-colony. So Ranadive and Sharkey's proximity is very interesting because Ranadive was criticized for Trotskyism and Titoism for supporting socialist revolution in India in 1948. So I don't know if this rings a bell to the speaker, because to me it's a very interesting follow-up. Number two, you see, my reading is, particularly after looking at the Moscow archives, is that we know now very clearly that the British Road to Socialism of 1951 was worked out between the Soviet Party and the British Party, and Stalin played a very important role in that. And we published from India the the discussions between Harry Pollitt and Stalin. Now, in those conversations, Stalin says that the British road to socialism is important not just for Britain, but for what he called the Anglo-Saxon countries. And that by that he meant Britain and Canada, and explicitly he mentioned Australia. So if we look at the two documents, I'm very excited about the two documents which the speaker has referred to, the program of the Communist Party of Australia of 1951 and Australia's path to socialism, because I've been looking for these documents even in Moscow and I couldn't find them, and I'd not found them in Manchester, not found them in London. So I really would like to get hold of them. But the point I want to make here is the interconnectedness of what the Australians are doing with what Stalin's advice is to the Communist parties in general, because at that time, Stalin had a big contribution to make to the British road to socialism. Parallel is, if you see the documents of the William Foster, he wrote a number of articles preparing a draft program for the Communist Party of the USA, in which he talks about the transition from People's Front to People's Democracy, because the discussion on all these programs was anti-imperialist. In fact, if the original program of the British Road to Socialism was a program for people's democracy, and I'm pretty sure that 1951 Australian program would be very similar. And anyway, I've talked enough. I don't want to speak too much, but I would be really interested in the two documents that Comrade showed us. I'd like to get hold of them, because we have put up on the archives of the Revolution Democracy Journal, which I helped to edit. We have put up the programs of a number of parties, of communist parties, and apart from Britain, but also USA draft program, Japanese program we have put up, where Stalin also played a big role. And so about a dozen party programs we have put up. We put up the Australian party program in 1958, but we could never find the 1951 program. And anyway, I'll end there. But I think this raises a number of questions which may be of interest to the speaker.
Thanks very much. Do you want to comment, Gregory?
Yeah, thank you for your questions and comments. They were very interesting. So the first comment about Sharkey and his kind of appearance at the Communist Party of India's Second Congress. So the way I have read it in this period in 1948 is that much of what the kind of Australian Party's criticism is obviously directed towards the British, but it's also directed towards what he would see as I think the right phrase they would use, as opportunist leadership. And this would include the leadership of the Indian Party led by Joshi. So it would be seen as a Dutt Joshi axis. That was what they constantly referred to it as. And when he was ended up being removed as General Secretary, and they took a more militant line, I think this was something which was very much with the support of the Australian Party, particularly Sharkey. To go to your second point about the kind of interconnectedness of the roads to socialism, and the debates and involvement of Stalin. Yep, I mean, I would agree. Again, this is something that is part of my thesis, and it's obviously not finished yet. But I think it's important to obviously include the role of Stalin and particularly the Soviet Union in creating these roads to socialism. But I think it is very much at the same time something which did have national kind of differences and did have kind of the ways in which these were implemented were very much dependent on the national parties themselves. So I seem to remember, as you rightly kind of mentioned, Stalin makes a reference towards it being a program which could be implemented across the Anglo-Saxon countries. But I think it's interesting that he even describes it as Anglo-Saxon to begin with. The fact that you can just kind of, implement it across all of these English-speaking nations, despite the differences and the kind of like the ethnic makeup, for instance, with the Canadian situation, with Australia, with the indigenous population, and obviously with the US, with all of the things that are going on with McCarthyism, etc. So I think it's something which has got more nuance to it than I think we can sometimes present it as. But yeah, I thank you for your questions.
Okay, thanks. Who else has got a question or comment? Steve.
Yes, I was wondering, and I don't know much about this, but was there a difference in the kind of level of class struggle in Britain and Australia at this time? I mean, were there more strikes in Australia? Was there a more militant kind of local actions, as it were, than was going on in Britain, to have had a kind of, as it were, radicalizing effect on the Australian Communist Party? Or is this much more done at a sort of intellectual level where, sort of where these discussions are being considered at a kind of leadership level? So yeah, I mean, so it really is this a reflection of kind of workers' militancy in Australia or not?
So the Australian Party, to begin with, just had a stronger presence within the trade union movement in the post-war, despite the fact that they were very much diminishing quite quickly in terms of membership in the years following the Second World War. They were very much, they still remain to have a strong presence in many of the unions, unlike the British Party, which kind of were isolated in strength to the mining sector with Arthur Horner and parts of the kind of steel industry, if I remember rightly. But with the Australian Party, they very much had quite a strong presence in many of these unions in particular. And there was a much stronger strike wave. And communists were involved in it. I think that was one of the differences, which was one of the beginning kind of criticisms from the part of the Australians, that the British had taken a reformist path, because there was a strong strike wave in the immediate post-war period. And this would be something that would kind of embolden the Australian Communist Party, because they'd had relative success with a lot of this. This would end up kind of informing their very strong anti-Labour Party sectarian approach. They would gain success, and this would kind of embolden them to such extent, kind of inflate their sense of self-importance, which would lead to, in 1949, the kind of infamous coal strike, where the chiefly government sent in the army, and which was the first time in Australian history, I believe, up until that point. And the Australian Party from then onwards kind of underwent somewhat of a kind of reconciliation for a number of years because of this miscalculation. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. I'm looking for questions for anybody else or comments, but while I'm waiting for other people to put their hands up, I can just throw in a question. I mean, I'm interested in the impact that the debate actually had on the Communist Party in Britain, both nationally and locally. As far as I'm aware, no members of the National Executive of the Communist Party in Britain resigned over this issue. I mean, Edward and Hilda Upward both resigned, Hilda first and then Edward. But it's interesting that in the discussions in both the Dulwich and the Camberwell Communist Party branches in which they were involved, the two secretaries of the branches then basically wrote, complaining about the Upwards' behaviour and basically asking Pollitt and Co. as to what they were actually going to do to stop this kind of disruption. So, I mean, clearly the Upwards circulated a number of their colleagues across the country, but that didn't seem to lead to further dissidence, but it may have led to further resignation. So, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, Pollitt and Duck really did seem to have very tight control over the branches and the membership. So I'm just interested in whether you've got a perspective on the impact across the country.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. I think, as I kind of mentioned throughout the talk, it is hard to get a full picture of how widespread this is, partly because a lot of the later documentation was very deliberately suppressed, because they were worried that this would have a wider effect on the membership. And that was very much the Australian Party's intention, to cause disruption, to cause what they hoped to be a change of leadership. I mean, I think it's interesting, just before I mention the local level, when they have this discussion in February 49 with the French Party actually say to them, there is no alternative leadership there to take this, you know, to take the mantle, so to speak. You know, the opportunities there for a you know, a different pathway isn't really possible at the moment, or at least we don't view it in such a way. When we get to the local level, I think this instance at least is probably the tail end of the opposition towards the Communist Party from the party's left, because many of the initially it began in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War with the 18th Party Congress, and this kind of carries on for the next few years. And I'd say by the end of this year, 1948, you tend to kind of see the end of what would be an official kind of opposition within many of the branches, whether they've just been they've resigned through you know, disillusionment with the party, or there is a kind of just dearth of literature which suggests differences with the party.
Okay, I saw Jill Scott first and then John Holford, but Jill.
Oh, thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you so much for your paper, Gregory. I really found it very fascinating, and I want to just say well done. You've done a phenomenal amount of research, and it's a really interesting work in progress. My particular question was that you in the middle of it, you had a very interesting document from the CIA about communists. Gosh, fancy the CIA looking into communism activity. And I wondered, that really is, I mean, obviously this is very early 1948, but the relationship between Australia and America and that Pacific location, the context in which the Australian Communist Party was operating, do you begin to get a feel of that really being a major reorientation, with, you know, the sort of special relationship between Britain and America, with Britain as becoming the junior partner, but all of this is very embryonic, and the Australian communists were clearly, from what you've said, taking more of a, you know, they're in the front line in a way, in terms of being policed not by just the Australian government, the British, but there's the Americans in the background. So I'm just interested in what your feeling of that is. I know it's very broad in general, but over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, that's very kind to hear. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it's actually something I'm very interested in. I think the kind of overarching anti-communist atmosphere was stronger in Australia than Great Britain, and I think my explanation for it, at least, is partly because the government that was in power was from 1949 was the Menzies-led Liberal Party, but it wasn't a Liberal Party. It was only its name. It was very, some people, and I would agree with them, would say that that government was essentially of the far right, and they have placated a lot of these the rise of a far right movement because they took such a strong position on many of these questions. I'd also say that because of, again, Australia's kind of geographical position and its isolation from the rest of Europe in particular, they did regard themselves as a exposed white settler power, and they felt as if they were at the threat of an invasion, particularly as the 40s went on and into the 50s, of an invasion of communists. And it was racialized. It was particularly from the China downwards. It was felt as if there was a threat from communism abroad and there was a threat from communism within. And Menzies at multiple points throughout the 1940s and 1950s, I think he even says that war will be with us within a matter of years, like 3 years or something like that. So there was this kind of a very strong ascendant anti-communist atmosphere. I mean, as I alluded to during the debate, the British Party, of course, there was a McCarthyist atmosphere, but no, not to the same extent as in Australia. I mean, the Australian Party, there was a Petrov case in 1954 with there was much earlier the referendum on the party's legality. There was obviously, as I mentioned, Sharkey was imprisoned in 1949-50. None of this happened in the British Party's case, and I think that does shape their sense of identity undoubtedly, and their kind of their trajectory.
Hey, John Holford, you're next.
Thank you. I agree. I find that very interesting. Two questions, really. One is if you could say something about the relationship or the comparative relationship between the communist parties in the two countries and the Labour parties, particularly given that we have Labour governments in both countries up till the late 1940s and early 1950s. Because the second point develops what you were saying just now, I think. The nature of Australia as a land of white settlement and the extent to which perspectives on race were different between the two countries at that point or during that period.
Yep, thank you for the question. There's actually a interesting paper from Evan Smith on this topic, on the kind of policing of communism. I think it actually might be called that, the paper, and it kind of covers a lot of what you're saying, this coordinated response across the Anglophone world in response to the communist threat. And this did impact, obviously, the Labour Party, given they were in power. I mean, it's interesting, for instance, that Harold Laski's an examination of the communist attitude, I can't remember what the exact title is, something along those lines, was distributed within Australia within the Australian Labour Party to deal with perceived communists or communist fellow travellers. And again, even there was within Australia where there was a formation of the groupers or the movement by B.A. Santa Maria, which was the industrial group. They were essentially a Catholic organisation on the right their job was to disrupt and root out potential communists within unions, which the Communist Party were ascendant in, and also within the ALP as well. I think the relationship between the two Labour governments, apart from kind of what I've just suggested in that kind of coordinated response to communism, I'm not 100% sure on how far that goes, but I think it's something that I'd like to look into more. So thank you very much.
Okay, David Horsley, you wanted to comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Apologies, I came in late, so apologies to the speaker. You might have mentioned this. Fascinating what I've heard. Just something, I mean, you mentioned the upwards and others in the British Party. There's a larger parallel in the American Party, because when, you may have covered this, I don't know. So tell me if you have. Silence means I'll carry on. When the American Party was dissolved by Earl Browder in 1944 to 45, only 2 members of the political, the Politburo, if you like, voted against. One was William Foster, and the other was Sam Darcy. What happened was they pushed Foster to retract and go along with it. Darcy wouldn't. They then pushed Foster to be the person who handed the expulsion to Sam Darcy. Now, within months, this was all overturned, and Browder was expelled, and the Communist Party of the USA was re-established within months. Darcy was never allowed back, and a number of other, let's call them leftists, who'd been members of the party from the beginning. Some of them had been Wobblies, Harrison George, Vern Smith, and others, who'd been in the American Party since the 20s, were also, so there was a kind of an expulsion of a number of people on the left in the American Party as well. So I just mention that because there is a parallel with what's happening in the UK with the upwards. My first information on this came from Harry Hayward's book, Black Bolshevik, many, many years ago, but other people have written on this because Hayward was a friend of both of them. That's it really, but thank you very much, Gregory. And apologies again for not coming in for not being present at the beginning.
Yes, just to remind people that the recording with all the PowerPoint presentation will be on the website early next week. Okay, so a number of people, obviously, especially those in Australia, didn't want to be awake in the middle of the night, so we'll no doubt listen to it soon. Anybody else with comments or questions? We've still got a bit of time. Anybody who hasn't spoken yet? Right, can't see anybody waving or sending me messages on chat. Okay, Gregory, do you want to say a few final words?
Well, just in response to the final question, yeah, I did comment on the role of Browderism within the presentation. It was something that the Australian Party used in their kind of ammunition as a critique of the British, and I would agree with what you've kind of suggested about it being a parallel to the American Communist Party, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. In terms of general comments to say, I don't have anything else to add apart from just saying thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it.
I'd just like to say one or two things.
Yeah, okay, Vijay, yeah.
You mind? I found in this, Jacques Duclos was mentioned here. I found in the Dimitrov archive in Moscow that actually behind Duclos, it was Dimitrov who got the thing going vis-a-vis Browder. That's one point. But my main interest is the 2 documents of the Australian Communist Party, the programme and the path. So how can I get hold of them?
You help, Gregory?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think I've got an electronic copy of it somewhere. I don't know where I got it from, but I'm more than happy to send it you. So if you you can send. I think on this PowerPoint I've got my contact info. So
I have both of your emails from when you registered. Wonderful. I will put you both in touch, and you can then see if you can sort something out between you.
Right.
Wonderful.
Our
Thank you very much.
intermediary. Thank you. Right. Any final comments before I just give a couple of quick announcements about the Socialist History Society? Thanks so much, Gregory. That was excellent. And I do see there is actually a version of your paper free on the internet. I don't know whether you realise that. So if you Google the title, everybody, you'll find it, as well as the published version. Well, also your BA dissertation's on the internet as well, I discovered. So while we're waiting for your PhD, which no doubt will be publicly available relatively soon, but good luck with it. Okay, in terms of Socialist History Society, those of you that aren't members, do join. For membership, not only do you get told about these talks, which are roughly one a month, generally online these days, because you get more people that way and people from all over the world. You also get the Socialist History Journal twice a year, normally a couple of occasional publications, which are either large pamphlets or small books, depending on how much people write. And also you get our newsletter. Our next meeting is online on the 28th this month, and Steve Cushing, who's going to chair that one, is going to say a few words about it.
Yes, the next meeting is entitled The Silence of Oppression on Thursday, the 28th of September at 6:30, when Hugh Brodie and Marilyn Moose will discuss how experiences of imperialism and exile from Nazism generate and rely on silences in both personal and political realms. They've both written quite extensively on this subject, and it should be an interesting discussion, particularly as they don't necessarily agree.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think that's our announcements. Hope to see you on the 28th or at a future meeting, and please do join the Socialist Society. We need more members, especially younger members, many of us getting far too old. And also, do tell us about any research you're doing, any book launches, because we can include that on the website and in our newsletter. The Socialist Society is very much for its membership, and we do need to broaden out the involvement of members in the society as a whole. So a bit more activity from you all, please. Okay, okay, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gregory. That was excellent.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me once again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, and yeah, very interesting. Right, I'm going to close it all down now. So bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.